84-year-old Frank Benedetto stood at the Family Feud podium with the slightly hunched posture of someone who had spent decades making people laugh in living rooms, neighborhood gatherings, and family dinners, but who had never once stood under bright lights with a microphone in his hand. Despite his age, Frank's eyes still sparkled with the mischievous humor that had been his trademark since childhood, and when he smiled, the deep lines around his eyes spoke of a lifetime spent finding reasons to laugh, even when life gave him plenty of reasons not to. Beside him stood his 25-year-old granddaughter, Lisa Benedetto, whose presence represented both Frank's greatest source of pride and his deepest source of regret about dreams he had never pursued. Lisa had grown up listening to Frank's stories, watching him turn mundane moments into comedy gold, and wondering why her grandfather, who was funnier than most people on television, had never tried to share his humor with a wider audience. When Steve Harvey asked the question that would touch the heart of Frank's lifelong dream, the response came from a place of humor tinged with resignation. "What would be your dream job if age didn't matter?" "Stand-up comedian," Frank said, his voice carrying both hope and the weight of 84 years of thinking it was too late. "I've been making people laugh my whole life, at work, at family dinners, in grocery store lines. My granddaughter keeps telling me I should try it, but come on, who wants to see an 84-year-old man telling jokes? The young people doing comedy today, they don't want some old guy taking up their stage time." The Family Feud studio fell into the kind of thoughtful silence that comes when 300 people simultaneously recognize they are witnessing someone's honest assessment of how society views aging and ambition. This wasn't just a game show answer, it was an elderly man's confession that he had let societal expectations about age prevent him from pursuing something that brought him joy and might bring joy to others. Steve Harvey felt his heart warm as he looked at Frank, understanding immediately that this man possessed the kind of authentic humor that comes from decades of life experience, resilience, and the ability to find comedy in the everyday struggles that everyone faces, but not everyone can articulate with humor. "Let me take you back to how we got here." Hank Benedetto had been telling jokes since childhood in Brooklyn in the 1940s. Even during hard times, Frank found ways to make his family laugh, turning struggles into stories that helped everyone cope. "Frankie could make a funeral funny," his mother used to say, recognizing her son's rare gift for finding light in dark situations. Throughout his youth, Frank had entertained family and friends with impressions and storytelling. He had natural timing, an ear for dialogue, and audience reading ability that suggested real performance talent. But Frank came of age when entertainment felt like something for other people, people with connections, people from certain cities. In 1958, pursuing comedy seemed as remote as traveling to the moon. Instead, Frank followed the expected path, married his sweetheart Maria, worked as a mechanic, and focused on building a stable life. His humor sustained his family through decades of working-class challenges, making him the entertainer everyone looked to when they needed reminding that life was still worth laughing about. After retirement, Frank moved in with his daughter Rose's family, including Lisa, who grew up with front-row seats to her grandfather's daily comedy show. From childhood, Lisa watched Frank turn breakfast conversations into comedy routines and help family members process disappointments through genuinely healing humor. "Grandpa, you should do comedy shows," Lisa would tell Frank regularly. "You're funnier than people on Netflix." Frank would deflect with humor. "Lisa, they want young, good-looking comedians, not old guys who need reading glasses to see their notes." But Lisa persisted, recognizing that Frank understood comedy on an expert level. His knowledge went beyond casual interest to scholarly understanding of the art form, and his material had grown richer with age, covering universal themes filtered through 8 decades of life experience. "Getting old isn't for wimps," was one of Frank's standard lines. "Yesterday I threw out my back, putting on my reading glasses. I went to the doctor, and he told me everything that's wrong with me would take longer than everything that's right with me. I said, 'Doc, I've got a dental appointment at 2:30, so let's just hit the highlights.'" Frank's comedy was naturally observational, focusing on the absurdities of daily life that everyone experiences, but that he had a gift for articulating in ways that made them seem both universal and hilarious. His material was clean without being bland, personal without being inappropriate, and accessible without being simple. The Family Feud opportunity had come through Lisa's persistence and Frank's reluctant agreement to something that felt less intimidating than a comedy club. Lisa had applied for them to appear together, writing in her application about Frank's lifetime of making people laugh and her belief that his humor deserved recognition. Frank Benedetto represents something beautiful about aging and creativity. Lisa's application had read, "He has spent 84 years developing a perspective on life that is both wise and hilarious, but he's convinced himself that it's too late to share that perspective with a wider audience. Maybe seeing him on your show would help other people understand that dreams don't have expiration dates." Frank had been nervous about appearing on television, worried that his humor wouldn't translate to a broader audience or that he would seem out of place among younger contestants. But Lisa had convinced him that Family Feud was a comfortable environment where his natural personality could shine. "Grandpa, it's just like talking to people, which you've been doing brilliantly for 84 years, Lisa had reminded him. "Steve Harvey appreciates genuine people, and you're the most genuine person I know." During the flight from New York to Atlanta, Frank had been thoughtful and somewhat anxious, not about appearing on television, but about whether people would find him amusing or just pathetic, an old man trying to be relevant in a world that had moved beyond him. "Lisa," he had said as they prepared for landing, "what if they think I'm just some old guy who doesn't understand that his time has passed? What if my humor is too old-fashioned for modern audiences?" Lisa had taken her grandfather's hand and looked directly at him. "Grandpa, humor that comes from truth and kindness never goes out of style. And you have more truth and kindness than most people, half your age." The Family Feud studios had been both intimidating and energizing for Frank. The bright lights and cameras reminded him of how far he was outside his comfort zone, but the energy and enthusiasm of the audience reminded him of the feeling he got when he made people laugh at family gatherings or social events. During the family introductions, Frank had presented himself with the mixture of humor and humility that characterized his approach to most situations. "I'm Frank Benedetto," he had said clearly. "I'm 84 years old, and I'm from Queens. This is my granddaughter Lisa, who thinks I'm funnier than I am, but keeps encouraging me anyway. I've been making people laugh for about 80 years, mostly in living rooms and grocery stores." The audience had responded with warm, appreciative laughter, and Steve had immediately recognized that Frank possessed the kind of authentic charm that made for great television. "Frank, 84 years young," Steve had said, with genuine warmth. "Tell me, what keeps you laughing after all these years?" Frank had smiled, in the way that suggested he was about to say something that would make everyone feel better about life. "Steve, at my age, you learn that you have two choices, laugh or cry, and crying makes your nose run, which is embarrassing when you're trying to tell a story." The audience had erupted in appreciative laughter, and Steve had immediately understood that Frank was someone special. The game had progressed with Frank participating enthusiastically and demonstrating the quick wit and natural timing that had made him beloved by family and friends. His responses were consistently clever, without being show-offy, genuine without being saccharine, and funny without being forced. The Benedetto team was playing against a family from Georgia, and both teams seemed to be enjoying Frank's presence as much as the audience was. During the second round, when Steve asked for things that get better with age, Frank had buzzed in with stories about how tough things used to be, earning the #1 spot on the board, and a huge laugh from the audience, who recognized the truth in his observation. But it was during the fourth round that the moment arrived that would potentially change Frank's life in ways he had never imagined possible. Steve had announced the survey question with his usual energy, not knowing that he was about to ask something that would allow Frank to articulate his deepest dream. What would be your dream job if age didn't matter? The question hung in the studio air, and for an 84-year-old man who had spent his entire life entertaining people in informal settings while convinced that formal entertainment was beyond his reach, the answer was both immediate and heartbreaking. Frank had stepped up to the microphone with the confidence that came from decades of making people laugh, but also with the resignation that came from believing his opportunity had passed. "Stand-up comedian," Frank had said, his voice carrying clearly across the studio. "I've been making people laugh my whole life, at work, at family dinners, in grocery store lines. My granddaughter keeps telling me I should try it. But come on, who wants to see an 84-year-old man telling jokes? The young people doing comedy today, they don't want some old guy taking up their stage time. The studio had fallen thoughtfully silent. This wasn't just a game show answer. It was an elderly man's honest assessment of how society views aging and ambition, spoken with the kind of self-awareness that suggested he understood both his talent and the barriers he perceived to using it. Steve Harvey slowly set down his index cards. Something in Frank's tone, a combination of genuine humor, deep longing, and resigned acceptance, told him that this was a moment requiring more than standard game show response. "Frank," Steve said gently, "you've been making people laugh for 84 years. What makes you think you should stop now?" Frank looked at Lisa, who was encouraging him with her eyes, then back at Steve. "Steve, the comedy world is for young people. They want fresh perspectives, current references, people who understand modern life. What do I know about smartphones or social media? My best material is about things that happened before most people were born." But what happened next was something that no one in the studio, not Frank, not Lisa, not Steve himself, could have anticipated. From backstage emerged a man whose presence immediately changed the energy of the entire studio. George Wallace, the legendary comedian who at 72 had been making audiences laugh for over 4 decades, walked onto the Family Feud stage with the confidence of someone who understood exactly why he was there and what he needed to say. "Excuse me," George said, approaching Frank with a warm smile. "Did I just hear an 84-year-old man say he's too old for comedy?" Frank stared at George Wallace, immediately recognizing him, but struggling to understand why a major comedian was addressing him on national television. "Mr. Wallace," Frank said, his voice filled with respect and confusion, "I can't believe you're here. I've been watching your comedy for years." "Frank," George said, "I'm 72 years old, and I've been doing stand-up for 45 years. You know what I've learned? The audience doesn't care how old you are if you can make them laugh. And from what I just heard, you've been making people laugh longer than most comedians have been alive." The audience was captivated, recognizing that they were witnessing something special, a master comedian addressing someone who had never performed but clearly had the heart of a comedian. "But Mr. Wallace," Frank said, "I don't have any stage experience. I've never performed for strangers. I just make my family and friends laugh." George smiled in the way that suggested he was about to share wisdom that comes only from decades of experience. "Frank, you know what the hardest part of comedy is: being genuine, being yourself, not trying to be someone else or copying what works for other people. You've been being yourself and making people laugh for 84 years. That's not a lack of experience. That's more experience than most comedians will ever have." What happened next was one of the most inspiring moments in Family Feud history. George Wallace made an offer that no one in the studio had expected. "Frank," George said, "I perform regularly at a comedy club in Los Angeles called The Comedy Store. It's where many of the great comedians got their start, and it's where many of us still go to work on new material. I want to invite you to do a set there. 5 minutes. Tell the stories that have been making your family laugh for 84 years. Let's see what happens when you share that humor with people who don't know you yet." Frank's face went through a series of emotions: disbelief, terror, hope, and excitement as he processed what George Wallace was offering him. "Are you serious?" Frank asked. "You want me to perform at a real comedy club?" "Frank," George replied, "I'm as serious as a heart attack. Age is just a number in comedy. Oh, what matters is whether you can connect with people and make them laugh. And something tells me you've been doing that your whole life." Lisa was crying openly, watching her grandfather receive validation for something she had always believed about him. The audience was on their feet, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a dream being fulfilled in the most unexpected way. Steve Harvey then did something that would become one of the most meaningful moments in Family Feud history. He removed his suit jacket, his lucky jacket that he wore to every taping, and approached Frank. "Frank," Steve said, his voice thick with emotion, "this jacket has been with me for every show I've hosted, but today it belongs with someone who just proved that it's never too late to chase your dreams. You've been making people laugh for 84 years. Now it's time to let the world see what your family has known all along. He placed the jacket around Frank's shoulders. You wear this to remember that experience isn't a disadvantage in comedy. It's your greatest asset, and George is right. Genuine humor never goes out of style. Frank pulled the jacket closer around himself, looking at George Wallace and Steve Harvey, then at Lisa, who was beaming with pride. "I can't believe this is happening," Frank said, his voice filled with wonder. "At 84, I thought it was too late for new adventures." George stepped closer to Frank. "Frank, let me tell you something about comedy and aging. The best comedians are the ones who have lived long enough to understand what life is really about. You've been married, raised children, dealt with loss, celebrated successes, survived challenges that young comedians can only imagine. That's not outdated material. That's comedy gold." The studio erupted in applause that wasn't just appreciation for entertainment, but recognition of something profound about dreams, aging, and the courage to try new things, regardless of what society expects from people at different stages of life. What happened after the cameras stopped rolling became a story of late-blooming success, intergenerational mentorship, and the power of authentic humor to connect people across age differences. George Wallace kept his promise, arranging for Frank to perform a 5-minute set at the Comedy Store 6 weeks after their Family Feud meeting. Frank's first performance was a revelation. His material about aging, marriage, parenting, and the absurdities of modern life, from the perspective of someone who remembered when things were different, connected with audiences in ways that surprised everyone, including Frank himself. His timing was natural, his delivery was conversational, and his perspective was both unique and universal. "I went to the doctor last week," Frank had told the Comedy Store audience during his debut, and he said, "Frank, you have the body of a 60-year-old. I said, "Doc, can you give me his phone number? I want to ask him what he did with it." The audience's response had been immediate and enthusiastic. Frank's material wasn't trying to be edgy or controversial. It was simply honest. Observational humor from someone who had lived long enough to find the comedy in experiences that everyone faces, but that he could articulate in ways that made them both relatable and hilarious. 6 months after his Family Feud appearance, Frank was performing regularly at comedy clubs in New York and Los Angeles, had developed a following among audiences who appreciated authentic humor, and had become something of a sensation in the comedy community, as proof that talent and genuine humor have no expiration date. George Wallace had become not just Frank's mentor, but a genuine friend, providing guidance about performance, material development, and the business side of comedy. Their friendship had become a beautiful example of how shared passion can create connections across generational lines. "Frank reminds me why I started doing comedy in the first place," George would say in interviews. "Not for fame or money, but because making people laugh is one of the purest forms of human connection." Frank has that purity in spades. 3 years after his Family Feud appearance, Frank was still performing regularly, had released a comedy album called Better Late Than Never, and had become an inspiration to older adults who had convinced themselves their opportunities for new adventures had passed. The episode became one of the most watched and shared in Family Feud history, sparking conversations about ageism, the value of life experience, and the importance of pursuing dreams regardless of when they occur to us. Comedy clubs reported increases in older performers at open mic nights following Frank's appearance, and many credited his example with inspiring them to try something they had thought was beyond their reach. The lesson that Frank taught that day extends far beyond comedy or entertainment. He reminded the world that experience is an asset rather than a liability, that authenticity is more valuable than youth in creating genuine connections, and that society's expectations about age-appropriate activities are often limitations we place on ourselves rather than real barriers to pursuing what brings us joy. Steve Harvey learned that day that the most powerful moments in television happen when you celebrate not just talent but courage, the courage to dream at any age, and the courage to try new things when conventional wisdom says it's too late. George Wallace learned that mentorship isn't just about helping people who are starting out, but about recognizing talent wherever it exists and providing opportunities for people whose gifts have been overlooked or undervalued. Because that's what dreams look like when they're finally pursued. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of fear and societal expectations. That's what comedy sounds like when it's authentic. Not perfect timing and polished material, but genuine observations about life delivered with honesty and warmth. And that's what happens when an 84-year-old man's lifetime of making people laugh meets a comedy legend who understands that talent and humor have no expiration date, proving that some dreams are worth pursuing regardless of when they find us or when we find the courage to chase them.